Great to have you. On Friday morning at Sandy Hook Elementary School, school prayer returned to that public school because one of the stories we're hearing this morning, as we heard over the weekend, was so many of the teachers huddled their children in corners and closets and they prayed together.
I think it's a common human reaction when all of our human answers have failed. That's when we maybe finally recognize that we really need God. And, I'm not suggesting by any stretch that if we had prayer in schools regularly as we once did, that this wouldn't have happened, because you can't have that kind of direct cause and effect. But we've created an atmosphere in this country where the only time we want to invoke God's name is after the tragedy. And I'm grateful. The president quoted scripture. He talked verses from the New Testament and spoke openly, and that's good. We need that kind of comfort. But, we need to create an atmosphere in this country where morality is not something we discuss only when we have no other place to run, which I'm afraid sometimes is the way it goes. We criticize anybody who invokes God's name except after a tragedy like this, and then it seems to be okay.
Exactly, Governor. When I put my children to bed at night, I say, God is always with you. When you wake up and you're lonely, know that He's with you. And yesterday at our church, Governor, it was so moving. They lit a candle for every one of the victims and they honored them. And it was so wonderful to know that if you are a person of faith, that you have a lot of questions why, but you have something to hold on to.
I heard it once said, Gretchen, and I think it's a very applicable statement, that even if you're a believer, you still hit bottom, but at least you find out that it is solid at the bottom. And so it's not that we're spared from grief or pain or suffering, because we're not. But we know that there is a world that goes beyond the evil and the horrors of this one and gives us some perspective to live for. And if we didn't have that hope, if there was not, and again, I refer to what the president said last night. He spoke of heaven. Those are words of hope.
Yep.
If we don't believe that there is such a place, if there's something beyond this physical life we live, then there is no hope. And I think it's important that we quit apologizing for having a spiritual conversation, that we somehow quit being ashamed that we believe in God. And we recognize it's the only thing that keeps us together when there's an inexplicable tragedy like the one we've seen this weekend with so much horror and so much pain.
But, Governor, as I mentioned when you were on the couch on Saturday, is that this town's got it together. It seems like a very spiritual place. It's the idyllic town. You'd sketch this out in a children's book and say this is where you want to grow up. Their reaction in the times in which the shooting was taking place, heroic. Their actions afterwards, tremendous empathy and sympathy from around the world. The guy that needed God was the shooter. And like the assailant is the problem, not the people in the town.
And Brian, when we create an atmosphere, when we tell people that God really isn't a part of our creation, that we're just biological accidents, and then we raise a whole generation to believe that He's irrelevant, that it's for people who don't have the intellectual capacity to think bigger than that it's for simpletons to believe in God, what should we expect? This is the net result. We reap what we sow when we only invoke God after the crisis, but we don't create the atmosphere in which we say we are accountable, that we are special because we're created with a purpose. Give a person a purpose, a sense of reason for existence, that he or she is the creation of an almighty, all-knowing God, and you give that person a basis for living that a person does not have if you honestly think that you're nothing more than an animated blob of protoplasm with nothing beyond this life.
That's well put. Governor, if anything good comes out of what happened in Newtown, it won't be just a discussion about guns and, our gun laws and things like that, but it'll be a broader discussion, just looking at how we have glorified violence in our culture, whether it's the movies or the video games or just a coarsening of the culture itself.
And Steve, that's an important discussion for us to have. When we separate violence from some purpose, people will say, but the Bible has violence. It does. But that violence was always couched in the terms of moral goodness or moral evil. It was never neutral. And that's where we end up with when violence becomes a part of some neutral expression. And that's the trouble with some of the games. Not that every kid who plays a video game is a potential mass murderer, because that's nonsense, but a child who already has a propensity towards some psychological disconnects, and then you lock that kid in his room with a computer screen and a smartphone with video games, and he doesn't have human connection. His only connection to the world is electronic, and a lot of that is molded by these incredibly violent images. And I think we end up seeing that you cannot operate a civil society in a moral vacuum. There has to be some sense in which morality exists, and then the question comes, where does morality come from? It doesn't just establish itself. If there's not an objective standard, in our case, I think we'd say there's a God who gives us the standard, then everybody gets to make up his own rules, and that's when a culture and a civilization completely falls apart.
Great conversation. Governor Huckabee, thank you very much, especially coming on this day when the first of the two victims are going to be buried in Connecticut.